Good evening, everyone. And I shall now introduce our guest speaker, Dr. John G. Panayotou. And before that, I'm going to read his bio, some of the things that he's done and been through and how he grew up. And it's really impressive. Here goes. John G. Panayotou was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, on December 2nd, 1967, as the only child to George and Lemonia Panayotou. His paternal lineage is Carpenisi, but his family settled in Athens in the late 19th century. His maternal lineage is from the island of Karpathos. Growing up as an only child provided John with being surrounded with adults, and thus he developed a deep vocabulary from a very young age while being fluent in both the Greek and English languages. He attended the Warwood schools, where he was involved with sports such as soccer, football, and wrestling. Yet it was a passion for books and learning which fueled his interest, especially reading about the Greek mythological epic tales. Having grown up in the Greek Orthodox Church, an abiding faith was instilled in him from especially his mother Lemonia. The church was a definite locus and anchor in the family life. Upon his graduation from Wheeling Park High School in 1986, John was accepted into Wheeling Jesuit University, where he earned a bachelor's degree. His main interests were history, literature, religion, and philosophy. He then went on to earn a master's degree at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, where he focused on the patristic literature of the early church fathers. John would go on to later pursue doctoral studies at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Upon graduation from St. Vladimir's, John would go on to serve nearly 2 decades in the Greek Orthodox Church in America in various capacities to the bishops of the metropolis of Pittsburgh and the metropolis of Atlanta. In 2006, he decided to leave the nonprofit world and enter the business world as an investment advisor, and then eventually founding and owning his own wealth management firm, Zion Financial Group, which focuses on retirement solutions for individuals. John would go on to earn a doctorate at Erskine Theological Seminary, where he also holds a professorship in early church history and Greek New Testament. He also holds a professorship at Cummins Memorial Theological Seminary, where he serves as liaison officer to the seminary president. John has had many scholarly articles published, and has earlier this year, in 2020, had his first book published, The Path to Oikonomia with Jesus Christ as our Lighthouse, which has been met with wide acclaim in the Orthodox Christian and non-Orthodox Roman Catholic and Protestant literary words. Dr. John G. Panayotou. Now, before that, I must add that he is a member of 3 university honor societies, Alpha Sigma Nu, Phi Sigma Tau, and Alpha Chi. Wow. Dr. John G. Panayotou is married to Corina A. Leading Panayotou. They celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary this year. Corina is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, where she earned a bachelor's degree in electrical/computer engineering. After completing her commitment as an active duty US Army officer, Corina entered the professional private sector and for the last several years has worked as a project manager for Google. John and Corina, live in the Charleston, South Carolina area. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share with you that I pestered John for a personal glimpse into his life growing up, and he was nice enough to send me the following. Anyone familiar with the real Greek culture will identify with this vignette. The best vignette I can give you, this is John's words, the best vignette that I can give you from my growing up years in the Appalachian town of Wheeling, West Virginia, in relation to the dominant American culture is that when I was young, the other kids would be playing cowboys and Indians, and I was having to dress up in fustanella, zarouchia, and fez, while reciting poems for the Greek Independence Day at church. Also, the other kids were eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch, while I was eating pasticcio and moussaka. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. John G. Panayotou. John.
Thank you, Andie. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that great introduction. And it's so nice to be here speaking to the Hellenic Writers Group of DC. I mean, I know if we weren't during COVID time, we'd be in person, so you would have had me come up. But this is great because then other people can participate that wouldn't be at the meeting. But it's great to be here with you and getting right to it, talking about my book. And I think we'll do this from what I'm told, or from what I've seen, 40 minutes, and then Andie, you can coordinate questions from everybody. So I wrote this book. This is a book that's been in my head for some years, and I had the opportunity to really develop it as part of a doctoral dissertation about 3 years ago. Well, maybe 4 years ago now, and then I tried to make it popularized, the manuscript, into something that was readable besides meeting the necessities of a dissertation that a lot of times nobody will ever read, besides your advisors, and just to have a completed dissertation. And I spent the last year and a half doing that. Or at least the last year, well, since it was published, a year and a half, when it would get up until the time it was published in July, getting it ready to be more of a popular writing style. And I know as in just listening to the group's emphasis on methodology and writing, whether in the Greek language or in the English language, that has its own pitfalls and trials and tribulations. But as I was preparing it, I had in mind that this was not just going to be an historical book, and we'll go chapter by chapter through it, but it was something that can be used within the context of the church, whether it's more particularly the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Christian Church, or as I've seen, and much to my surprise, and it based on interest and whatnot and promotion and other denominations, other churches, Roman Catholic and Protestant denominations of various ilks. This is something that people can relate to, the concept of stewardship, Christian stewardship, and I'd even venture to say, even from not a faith-based perspective, I think nonprofits can glean something from this, because we hear about stewardship being a topic of, Coca-Cola, they have, just even locally, I see they have a director of stewardship. Now, they mean something a little bit different than what we would mean from a Christian faith-based perspective. But even so, my idea was, a lot of times people have functional definitions of themselves, and it's and you see especially in the realm of people's successes, whether it's their own or their children's or whomever. And you hear, oh, so-and-so, he just got accepted to this college, or so-and-so, she just had this great promotion at this company. And they just bought a new house, this big house, and they're doing great. They're going to all these vacations and stuff, and their children are perfect. Everybody hears that. And the reality is, it really gave me an opportunity to pause and think, because everything that comes after baptism, as I've heard it say, is stewardship. And we could say it in those terms, in that what I mean by that is everything that the whole purpose of the book is that we don't own anything, even our very lives are gifts from God. And we are at best managers of all of these things. So I begin the book. The book begins with a preface from a friend of mine who's Bishop Alexis Trader of Bethesda, who he grew up a Methodist, and in Delaware. He was an only child, so he and I are only children, so we get to commiserate at times about that. And he got introduced from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy when he was in college at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And he went on to seminary, and then he went on to Mount Athos and spent 2 decades on Mount Athos at Karakalu Monastery. So, and during that time, he went and got a doctorate. He's fluent in Greek. He speaks university level Greek. His Greek is even better than my Greek, I would say. And here he earned a PhD. There he earned a PhD in theology at the University of Thessaloniki. So I had asked him to write the foreword to this book because I found a publisher. And I know based on the group, part of it is knowing how to get published and methodology and stuff. And I can just say, I went to people such as Bonnie Thurston and asked, what do you do and how does this work? And that's a whole nother world. Publishing, I don't have to tell anybody that's tried to get anything published, that's almost like a closed business. Now, there's crazy things. People publish things that you don't think that should be published, and they get published and they get pushed. But then there's other things that it's like a really closed business, And even people that are well published don't always get the yes, which is crazy too, even when you're a name, So here I'm, in this realm, I'm not a name as far as getting books published, because they don't care how many articles you get published and where you get them published. They want to talk about, well, the book sell, is there a market for it? So anyway, I had gotten the OCP, Orthodox Christian Publication, OCP Publications, to agree to publish my book. And then with that, the start of that was the idea that when it did get published, they issued a press release, and then somehow this book took off. It wasn't, we didn't have a marketing campaign. Our budget was zero, but somehow it got traction. And at some point it went in its genre, Orthodox. Again, Amazon sells 85% of the books here in the States, and it had a genre of in Orthodox Christianity and in Christian stewardship. It reached within the top 100, and at one point it was actually in each category #1. So, having said that, the preface of the book is an introduction of the book from somebody, at least of the Orthodox bishops, that is very esteemed, Bishop Alexis. His job, he's the auxiliary bishop in charge of seminaries, St. Vladimir Seminary, St. Tikhon Seminary, and all the monasteries of the Orthodox Church in America. So, with that, the book begins with a preface, which I was very glad that he agreed to do from him. And my first chapter in the book is an introduction to what I meant by stewardship. Now, Christian stewardship, I didn't use the title stewardship because I thought that was, in consulting with other people, that was a banalized word. So I used the Greek word oikonomia, and banalized in the sense that people just think about stewardship, they think of money and fundraising and, you know, that kind of a thing. And I didn't want people to have that precognition of what this book was about. I wanted them to pull from, when they got this book, that they would have a whole new mindset after reading it. And that was my attempt about it. That was based in the roots of Christianity, the Judeo-Christian heritage tradition. So I went ahead and in my first chapter, I deal with the problem, as I see, of Christian or stewardship in the churches today. And that is basically a misunderstanding of stewardship. And I use the word oikonomia in the title because, as the ancient Greeks would use it, and as it was used by the early church fathers of the first 6 centuries, of the notion of being good managers of the household. Oikonomia. Oikos being the ancient word for house. We also see that in Koine Greek, in the New Testament, Holy Scriptures, of the house, Ikia, and the oikonomia being the notion of good household management. And we base this on the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, as everything it revolves around him from a Christian perspective, because we don't worship a creed, we don't worship a liturgy, we don't worship the scriptures themselves, we worship a person, and that's Jesus Christ. So hence, that's where the title came from. And in the first chapter, I lay out the problem, if you will, of the church's misunderstanding in its contemporary context, and probably for maybe since the age of Constantine, I don't know, it could be argued, of what stewardship is, for a variety of reasons. You know, the church-state relationship, being a department of, in Europe, being subsidized by the state. In the United States, the whole idea of fundraising and Greek festivals and this and that. I mean, you could put it all into your own context. As a Southern Baptist had told me, a pastor had told me, he said, well, don't go too far, because I remember growing up when we had bluegrass night with hot dogs and hamburgers, but that might as well have been a Greek fest, because we talked about stewardship, we talked about tithing, but we were trying to raise money, and there's no ands, ifs, or buts about it. So this is a context that we all can relate to. If we've been part of a community, and as Christians, we're called to be part of the worship within a faith community of some kind, regardless of its liturgical expression. So, having said that, that is what I've laid out in the first chapter. The second chapter deals with the Old Testament paradigms of tithing, and as you see in the cover, it is of Melchizedek. You can see the cover of my book behind me. Melchizedek, who was the paradigmatic high priest of the Old Testament. Well, we don't know anything else about Melchizedek. He was from Salem. We didn't, hey Steve, good to see you. We didn't know anything else about him. It's just that here he appeared out of nowhere to do one thing. He doesn't do anything priestly per se. He doesn't do anything that would indicate what he is, anything that would be sacrificial, because that would be the thing that marks the priesthood, is offering sacrifice. But he goes and collects a tithe from Abraham. A tithe, the 10% of the 10% of the booty that he collected, or he accrued during his during the spoils of war. And yet he is considered the paradigmatic priest, the high priest, the paradigmatic priest of the Old Testament, a prefiguration, which we would say from a Christian perspective, being the archetype, the metaphor, the perfect example of that is perfected in the God-man, Jesus, in the New Testament, the second person of the Trinity, the divine Logos. So I go through all of that from the Old Testament perspective, land ties, how the tenth was evolved in that form of obligation of tithing to support the Jewish temple life, as well as the poor. There was always a sense of social consciousness for the poor. And then in the third chapter, I deal with the New Testament dealing with such things. With Jesus, Jesus talks about money and possessions more than he talks about any other thing. He talks about that beyond more than he talks about heaven and hell and anything else. So this is, there's like 2,300 and some verses in the Old and New Testaments that deal with money and possessions. So that's how much of an impact this is, or at least an emphasis there is within the Holy Scriptures themselves. And with that, even though Jesus and the apostles, and particularly the Apostle Paul, don't mandate the tithe as the legalistic minimum, they actually, if you look in the book of Acts, you see that it's exactly the opposite. We're supposed to be giving of everything. Jesus is talking about he wants our very lives. He just doesn't want us to do a minimum. So the minimum, we can breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, we don't have that legalistic notion of 10%. And I see that became an issue in, especially post-Reformation history. But yet, the minimum means that we're supposed to give of our entire lives, and that's the paradox. So we're not legalistically bound, but out of love, we're called to even give our very lives to God and service to God and others. And then in the fourth chapter, I deal with issues of or the history from the time of the apostles, and then going from the apostolic fathers, their successors, their students, their disciples, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, Irenaeus of Lyon, Justin Martyr, the Vivahi, which is the earliest Christian manual next to the New Testament that we have, and then going all the way through to the 4th century. With the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory Theologian, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Athanasius the Great, and the councils thereof, all the way through Jerome, Augustine, into the 6th century. So the first 6 centuries of the Christian Church beyond the Old Testament. And then finally, in the final chapter, I deal with matters such as how do we implement this into our daily lives? What's the practical implications for us today? So that is the thumbnail view of the book. If I were to say anything, it gives the book. I tried to in a synopsis. I mean, there's volumes and volumes that can be written, and there are volumes and volumes written on each of these different epochs, these eras of what I've just described to you. But within a 1-volume book of reasonable reading, I've tried to give you a blueprint from a Judeo-Christian perspective and a patristic, from a biblical and a patristic, the writings of the church fathers, the early church fathers, perspective of what Christian stewardship, Oikonomia, what meant and means, and its implications for us today, and all the pitfalls of where we find ourselves today in contemporary Christianity. So that's the whole purpose of my book. And as I said, it's I mean, I knew there was going to be a niche for it. I just had that feeling. I just didn't realize that there would be such a diversity of of interest. It's been it's been embraced, or it's been well received, and I'm just grateful. Hopefully, that if it can get other people to change their mindsets, or at least reflect on certain dispositions that they have towards their stewardship to God, and what that means in their community life. That's what I've tried to do, setting out in this book. Andie, do you have any questions you want to lead me into? Oh, you're on mute, Andie. You're muted.
Yes, I was a good girl. Yes. Talking about that, the later part of your book, have you spoken with people to get the feel of the average layman with the whole story of this, to get the feel and pass it on?
I have. And it's not so much in this book that the results are in. I'm, God willing, by the end of the year, I'm going to have a workbook out. We just kind of run into a little bit of a pitfall, because my personal editor is my wife, Corina, and her father has taken ill this last few weeks, so she's having to tend to him. So, but the idea is that there was a few years ago, as part of my research, I did a seminar at the Greek Cathedral in Columbia, South Carolina. Good friend of mine, Father Michael Platanis, the dean there, he's the pastor there. And so at that time, we did a survey, and I have the results, the survey before the seminar. Now, how can you gauge these things in from a one-day seminar? But you really can't. But 8 hours later, we did another thing of asked the same questions and tried to gauge that with the questions such as, I'm entitled to my money. Well, you had like 90% of the people thought, well, yeah, I'm entitled to my money. I earned it, And maybe by the end of the seminar, at least at the end of the day, they said, well, maybe if you look at it from a different perspective, God owns everything. I'm just a manager of it. So, yeah, and I think a lot of people have misconceptions. Lay people have misconceptions of what stewardship is, because so many of the clergy have misconceptions of what stewardship is. And I can tell you, at least in my experience, in seminaries, that that's not taught. I mean, it really isn't. I mean, they might say it ends, if it is, it's like, well, how to do fundraising or administration, and that's not what we're talking about.
So actually we need the guidance, because as you said, there are preconceptions, even the people in the church. So we just follow like good little sheep, whatever we're told. Most, at least our generation. I mean, the future generations, the later generations, they are more inquisitive, they dig more, and they make up their own minds, but we were brought up differently. So then it should start at the source, the change.
That's the idea.
Why your book is having such a good reception from all kinds of Christian denominations, because it has filled a special niche that people identify with. We were probably all waiting for something like this, the light to come on, the guidance. So what can you say about that?
And the irony is that it's not something new. It's that old time religion. We just need to get reacquainted with it, or be, or be introduced to it. and I think, and this brings up you bring a great segue in there, because what you, and I lay this out in the book, in Judaism, in the Hellenistic era, after the Jews had, well, I guess, I mean, the time before 1948, the last time the Jews had control of Palestine, of Jerusalem, of the Holy Land, it was the 200 years before the time of Christ, during the Hasmonean Empire, when they defeated the Greeks, the pagan Greeks of Syria, Antiochus, Antiochus, Epiphanius, Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, and with the Maccabean revolt. And by that time, you have a situation by the time of Jesus where legalism with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I mean, more so the Pharisees and the temple priests, that became, within the cultic life of Judaism, it was almost a mechanistic, legalistic milieu. So Jesus comes at a time when it was an existential crisis within Judaism, especially their relationship to God and their relationship to each other, and and everything was kind of skewed. The money changers in the temple was the great metaphor. And then you have the church after the time of the resurrection, and on that end of the resurrection and the time of Pentecost, you have the church for the first 400 years being threatened, but on all fronts, an underground faith. But then you have the Edict of Milan in 312, after Constantine wins the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in Italy and becomes the emperor of all of Rome, and he legalizes Christianity. Now, Christianity, it wasn't until 60 years later that it was made the official religion, but still it was legalized. And having said that, by the time it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it became melded with the state, and it was subsidized by the state through taxes. And then you have that, and that's continued to this day in Europe. I mean, at least in Greece, even during the Muslim Ottoman Turkish rule. I mean, you had the millet, the Rum millet. They were collecting taxes and stuff. I mean, it was under the Pasha. So there's not this notion. Now, that doesn't mean people weren't giving. That doesn't mean people weren't giving all they could and they didn't do things. It just means that, as with anything else, we're given time and opportunity to rethink things. Now we come to the New World in the Americas, especially North America, Canada, and in the United States. I mean, for the last 150 years, since the time of the Civil War, when even though there were Greeks, you can look at, I'm just using Greeks as an example, because in Alaska you can use Russians, and in San Francisco Russians and all that from that end. But the Greek experience here, and then subsequently the Arabic experience here among the Christians, and this was true even with Roman Catholics. I mean, it was the club experience, okay? Whereas the people actually trying to do stewardship were the Protestants. The Protestants came to this country. I mean, the Puritans. I mean, they were practicing. But that was where it became the issue of, well, is it a legalistic thing? Do I have to give 10%? And and then you got that whole issue. But among the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Roman Catholics, I mean, you had the club mentality, in that you have an immigrant church that needed to be funded by something. And I don't know if it was pierogi sales, or I don't know what became Greek festivals or what, that people were paying dues. I mean, people were paying like they were members of the country club they couldn't get into, in the regular country club where they golfed or something with Scottish people. They were having this, that was the way church was. Now, I'm not criticizing it. I mean, it's just the reality. They came here to work in the mines and the mills, and they had restaurants, little diners. And then they made, no matter how much they profited, they still had that mindset, and individually. So as much as it's not this isn't a refutation of those that have come before us that did the best they could do. It's just that, okay, we're here now. If we're really going back to the basics, let's understand what that means and its full implications. Because I mean, God reveals things in different times, and it doesn't mean it's anything, it's a new revelation. Sometimes it's just the right time to be reminded or to be educated. So that is a history. Now, I don't know, you know, I know with whether it's in Greece, and I don't know how different it would be in your context, Andie, in Amman, Jordan. I think it would be more similar to Greece than here in the States. Would you concur?
Yes, yes, I think so. Yes, it would be more like Greece than in the States. It's, yeah, very similar. Everything is very similar because we are all Mediterranean people, and you know, we sort of tend to react in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The context changes a little bit because in Jordan, you know, we have the diversity of religion, and that gives another light things. But perhaps I can also ask if somebody from the audience would like to put in a question to Dr. John, Dr. Panayoto. Okay, Diane, would you please? You're on mute.
Just a comment. My grandfather immigrated in 1903 and ended up in Dayton and was a laborer. And he left the Orthodox Church because he could not afford the dues. He said that, and it was a very specific amount of money. It was more than he was making. And so he was not Orthodox. And yet he still liked the church. And like when he was older, he would go to church. And we always knew about the church, but we were not members. So I guess that's just confirmation of what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, it was, I've even, well, I mean, I've heard stories where, I mean, where, you know, where somebody would die and they will say, okay, they weren't connected to a local congregation, parish. And then they say, well, the family would say, well, we want to do a funeral. And they go to the priest and he said, well, no, well, you have to go pay a back dues by so many years, which was absolutely crazy. I mean, they're going to spend like I don't know what the dues were, like $300 or something, but go spend like $1,000 so you can, you know, just crazy stuff. And then I remember, I'll tell you a real good story. I remember there was we lived for about 7 years in the Clarksburg, West Virginia area, which is about 2 hours south of where I grew up. My wife and I lived there in Bridgeport, West Virginia, and I remember seeing at the candle stand at the Pangadi there. One of the parishioners was showing me, oh, look at this. They were showing me from back in the day, 1920s or maybe 30s or 40s, 1940s. They had it framed. It was a fee-based thing. Baptisms, $5. Funerals, $10. Weddings, you know, $15 or whatever. I mean, it was crazy, but it's that kind of mindset.
Yeah, when my grandfather died, the other side of the family, he had married a woman from Kentucky, so he had what was, quote, a holy roller preacher. And the rest of the family was horrified. So, yeah, these things play out in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, I'm wondering, when you're talking about stewardship on a more general level, what concerns you might have about the effect of the isolation that everyone is going through right now, like the long-term or at least maybe short-term effects of being isolated and being forced to be independent of other people, and how that's going to affect when things open up, or how it affects now their empathy.
Well, I think with that, I think just in general, now we're getting, I mean, like I said, you know, I've heard it said that somebody was saying that stewardship is everything after baptism. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. What do we do with it? You know, I think that church life has been the last 8 months have changed, you know, the way we interact as a culture. And we need to find a way forward. Okay, we're going to probably be like this for another year, So we need to find a way forward. But what happens after that year? I mean, I think how can it not be different? I would hope that we become more reflective and appreciative, or appreciative and reflective of what, with this quiet time, if you will, that the pandemic has brought us. I don't know what that means as far as giving. That shouldn't change anything, whether people show up or not. It's not like we're going to the theater. I mean, we still, God is God, whether we're watching online, or worshiping in person. Whatever we need to do, protect the people that need to be protected, and then, but the rest of us need to figure out how to do this. But even if we're not in person worshiping, and it doesn't take its place. It just means that as far as stewardship goes, we should still be making our sacrificial gifts to God and His work. Bonnie, you were going to say something. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I was getting permission to talk before I unmuted.
Yes.
Today in the Western Church is the 30th Sunday after Pentecost, and the gospel lesson for today is, I think, really for us in the Western Church, is, I think, really relevant to what you're talking about. And it's the question in Matthew, do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And it's not a secular, a secular sacred distinction. It's, I think, Jesus saying what you're saying, which is, well, what's not God's? Render unto God what is God's, which is everything. Isn't that really what you're also suggesting in your book?
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Well, I didn't say it. Jesus did.
I know, but you reminded us of it. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Do you think there was, in preparation for the book, something that was peculiar, and I don't mean that weird peculiar, I mean specific to the Greek fathers, that you wouldn't find, say, either in the New Testament or the Latin fathers?
Well, that's a great question. I would answer it this way. I think a really safe way to say that is, whether there were Greek fathers or Latin fathers, I think at some point, whether we're talking about John Chrysostom or Augustine or Irenaeus of Lyon, who really was from Smyrna, I guess, and then he went to France, but that's another story. Or Ambrose of Milan, we'll use him as an example. I would say the following. I think in their roots, because when we talk about Christianity for the first 1,000 years that was united, the roots, whether they were Eastern or Western, Greek or Latin, the roots are there in both. I just think that you had things that happened in the Middle Ages and at the time of the schism that were unique to the Roman Church, what became the, from the Western Church, the Latin Church, that were also what became known as the Roman Church, that you did not have situations of in the Greek Church or the Eastern churches. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I just think that they were de-emphasized. There were a lot of things that were de-emphasized. It wasn't because it wasn't present. It just that they were in the roots. It's just they, through innovations or deviations, whatever you want to call them, or developments. I mean, you ended up having, like in the Middle Ages, with nominalism and whatnot, and nominalism in a sense of nomenclature, trying to name everything in the classic sense of how many angels are on a pin, probably from Thomistic thought. You have things like indulgences, which was a total fundraiser, for Rome, and of course that's what birthed the one of the reasons the Reformation was birthed, it's within the Roman Church, the Protestants protesting, Luther in particular protesting against that. Because all of the reformers were all, for the most part, with the exception of Calvin, they were all clergy. They were all Roman Catholic clergy. That, whether it was John Knox in Scotland, whether it was Huss, whether it was, John Huss. All these guys have John names. I don't know if I guess they're Hellraisers if you're named John. But the point is, they all came from those similar roots. And I think, to answer your question, it was a matter of de-emphasis of some things and overemphasis of other things. But I could say that was true within theology beyond the theology of stewardship. It was even true with everything else, because kind of it's interconnected in that in the West, the theology of the cross was a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal in both East and West, but the East focuses more on the resurrection beyond that. The West, oh yeah, there's a resurrection, I mean, it's like, I'll give you an example. It's a popular example, The Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson's movie there. He goes in, great, fine. He goes into this excruciating example of Christ being flagellated. And that's all part of it. And the flesh being torn and him on a cross, that's a big part of it. And then he spends like 30 seconds on the resurrection. Jesus walks out of the tomb. Well, that's great. But you can't have one without the other. I just think that the emphasis should be on both. It's just, I think that it was, I think that it's present. It just has over time gotten de-emphasized. But I can argue that in case of stewardship, it really just as much got de-emphasized within the Eastern churches. And that's why we're in the mess we're in. Yes, Stephen. I'm sorry, Andie, I'm taking one of your jobs away. You're supposed to tell them.
Thank you. You're very helpful. Very helpful. Stephen, please go ahead.
John, when we read the gospel narrative, right after the gospel narratives, there's the book of Acts, right? And
yep.
When we read the gospels, it's as though Jesus is with us, and then we go right to the book of Acts. And the way the book of Acts is written, even in the beginning of the book of Acts, you really do see the common faith of the believers. There was a common faith. There was a fellowship. There was a devotion that was vertically, it was to God and to one another in such a way that I wonder if the church has ever experienced since. I doubt it. I somehow feel that after the Apostle Paul's time, there have been fizzles of revival. There have been periods of revival, such as the Reformation and other times. But I think the title of your book speaks to Jesus as being the lighthouse, okay? And I think that is what will speak to people of different denominational thought, okay? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to Jesus being the lighthouse and what would be the impact of your book, not so much on the way churches and organizations would function, but on the life of the little guy. What is that? Could you speak to that?
Yes, I think that ideally, and that's perfect. It's not just what the groups do. It's how the person it internalizes it into a way of life and everyday living. I think the impact would be that, I mean, if we really lived by Jesus Christ as the lighthouse, as our focus, I mean, wouldn't we live radically differently than we do? I think it would be venture to say. I mean, even if people just believe, there was a recent poll that in Newsweek that 52% of the people in America believe that Jesus was a good man. Jesus was a nice guy, so we should be nice guys too. They don't see him as God. Now, the Holy Scriptures, whatever anyone wants to believe or not, the Holy Scriptures teach that Jesus is God. He was God, is God, period. So how would we radically internalize that into our lives of true stewardship for the little guy, so to speak, every day? I mean, every day would be a gift. We'd be doing what we're supposed to be doing, living as doxological, Eucharistic beings in communion with God, and ultimately seeking union with God in the Holy Spirit. And consequently, our relationship with each other would change. It wouldn't just be, these superficial interactions. I mean, I would really be caring as I should and loving as I should you, Stephen, or Andie, or anyone, so that in a fuller sense, not just in lip service. So it's totally transformative if we're using that, as I see it, as a part of our lives. It goes even beyond the local congregation, even though there's that component, it really changes the individual way of being. And the other thing about my title, just rather quickly, is, the people would look at it and say, well, the path is a land thing, and the lighthouse is a sea thing. Well, an ocean thing. I'm not looking at it as us going on the boat. I'm looking at it from us being on the land, finding a path to where the lighthouse is. I'm looking at it from the whole purpose of that is to look at it 180 degrees differently than we think of things. It's a paradigm shift for individually and communally. That's what I think. I think it would be a radical, transformative experience in our journey towards union with God and true union, harmony with each other. That's what I think, Stephen.
Actually, the lighthouse, to me, embodies that it is the solid thing, as you said, that you can see from all around 360 degrees, from the sea and from the land, and usually it's in a higher place. And it's all, wherever you look, you're there. And from there, you can see everything else. I think that's amazing that you have put that word in the title. I had a last small question that you mentioned the pitfalls today. Can you elaborate, please?
Well, I would say the pitfalls, and using the U.S. as the example, because at least, using that as example, that's what I would know the most intimately, the best. I think the pitfalls are today that people, many times, they wouldn't want this radical transformation experience in that it's not in the comfort zone, because we really have to live differently, wouldn't we? On an individual basis. On a communal basis, the pitfalls are, well, we haven't done that here before like this, or this is the way we do things here. It's that kind of mindset, but it doesn't work. I think at some point you have to come to the conclusion and just say it doesn't work anymore. And I think those are the pitfalls. It's the mindsets that are closed to a new mindset. That's the biggest one.
Yes, but nothing is impossible.
Nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible.
You have to find the how. It's there, but you have to know how to look.
How to look, right?
How to look. And now we know the author of this amazing book. And we'll see you all next month. Hopefully, Patty can join us.
Yes.
And if not, we will hold a candle till the following month. And thank you, everybody. It was great to see you all. Thank you, Diane, for the first part of the meeting. And I'll just say good night